Hello guys, this is Namo Abdulla in Washington, D.C. Today I'd like to introduce you to a young and aspiring Kurdish author from Iran. He just published a very timely book. It's a memoir of his family from Iran, where they lived for years, and why they decided to move to the United States in the mid-90s. As I said, the book is very timely because it comes at a time when the United States Trump administration has imposed unprecedented sanctions on the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I'm really looking forward to talk to the author today about his brilliant book that just came out, as I said, last year in October. So Hawreh, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Talking to Rudaw.
It's good to be here.
Absolutely, and this is your first book. I know you've lived in the United States since you were 2 years old, and you decided to move back to Iran for a visit when you were in high school.
Right.
And was that when you realized that you had to write something about Iran?
Yeah. So I was a freshman in high school when my parents decided to head back to Iranian Kurdistan. So we were surprised that, hey, we're going to go on vacation after you finish freshman year, and let's go back. And it was great. You know, every high school wants to take a vacation. You're in school, you've been working most of the time. So we were all looking forward to it, but then we soon realized that Dad couldn't come with us. We all wanted to go, but Dad couldn't come because he was a Peshmerga. He was a freedom fighter. And so my younger sister, my brother were upset.
So he had been a Peshmerga in Iranian Kurdistan in the 80s.
Yeah, so this 79 revolution took place in Iran, which kicked out the Shah from a monarchy and brought Khomeini, the Ayatollah, who brought in the Islamic form of rule. And so he fought for democracy, autonomy, and greater rights for the Kurds. And so he did that for about 20 years, and the book highlights that. But as a high schooler at the time, it didn't all make sense. Why did Mom and Dad fight? Why did they leave? And why can't he go back today? These were questions that I was asking myself.
Iran is the country where they were born.
Exactly.
But your family was different from most of Iran's population because they were Kurdish.
Exactly.
And being Kurdish, you know, also like most Kurdish people in Iran are not Shia Muslims like the rest of the Iranian population. They are Sunnis. And what does that mean? For somebody to be both Sunni and Kurdish in Iran, what does that mean?
You know, it's tough. It's a tough life. The unfortunate reality is that being a Kurd in Iran makes you a clear minority. And when I talk about minorities, it's not going to be the same conversation that we have in the United States, because minorities, for the most part, are equal, right? They have equal opportunities here in the United States. You don't have to fear persecution in the United States. No one's actively trying to hunt you down. But in Iran, if you're a Kurd, you automatically become a minority. But also religiously, like you mentioned, predominantly Kurds are Sunni Muslims. And Iran, the biggest minority there is the Persians. So they're kind of dominant in culture, politics, and things of that nature. So when you're a Kurd, you instantly feel restricted.
Right. So there was one passage in the book that really caught my attention. I think it's on page 94. Just want to read that passage. You kind of had a conversation with your uncle, who continues to live in Iran, I believe. So I hope this wouldn't put him in trouble.
Yeah, so actually, on that point, I actually didn't put their names.
Okay.
You know,
so what
just for the safety. Exactly. Yep.
So you basically, he tells you here that you would be arrested if you don't shut up. And then you say, really, I'll get a lawyer then. I won't let anyone, not even the wealthiest or most powerful person, infringe on my rights. I insist. And then he started choking and laughed the rest of the gray smoke out. So he was smoking, apparently. The Bill of Rights does not exist here, my friend. And then that's basically what he told you about Iran.
Yeah.
And so you were young, you were like a high school kid. It made sense, like what you told him, basically, you know, like this American mentality that, you know, nobody can just put me in prison for no reason. But apparently your uncle told you that was the case in Iran.
Yeah, there are a lot of examples of how life was different in Iran when compared to the United States. And I think some of us, and I'm sure some of the viewers will realize that life is different. And we take for granted sometimes the rights we have, the protections we have here in the United States. But going back there, I wasn't really familiar with the customs in Iran. I didn't know exactly what the policies were and why people should be treated differently. I assumed a lot of people live like the United States as Americans, but it became clear by the end of my trip that being a Kurd, being an Iranian for that matter, you have a very limited amount of say. And so it's true, the Bill of Rights don't exist in Iran. You can't speak freely and criticize, you can't talk about politics. And when you're a Kurd, it makes it, far more worse because they see it as a threat.
And to be fair, there are like laws
Sure.
that on the books.
Exactly.
Freedoms are kind of protected. Of course, there are like contradictory laws
Mhm.
in Iran, but the problem is not always the law itself. It's more about the enforcement of the law.
Yeah.
And of course, there are really draconian laws
Sure.
in Iran as well.
Mhm.
But like of course, you have the morality police.
Yep.
That prevents women from being seen on the streets without
Proper clothing.
Exactly, proper clothing, which is basically covering all of your
Yeah.
body except for your face.
Yep.
So did you go with your sisters as well?
Yeah.
And your mom? Did they have to change the way they live here?
Yeah, so actually, and I talk about this in the book too, is once we landed in Tehran, the captain came on board and said that, just a reminder, no alcohol is allowed in Iran. We are a religious country here. For your own safety, please respect these laws.
As soon as you entered Iranian
As soon
airspace.
as, exactly, as soon as we were about to land in Tehran, the captain came on the microphone and said, women also please cover up and respect the, religious code here. And for my sister, that was weird. And I kind of jabbed her throughout my trip that, hey, I don't know.
Was she also your age in high
Yeah,
school?
yeah, she's a couple years older than I am, but it was kind of funny because I was poking at her and like, hey, I don't have to cover up, and how come girls have to do that and guys don't? And so she was very frustrated by that, and it makes sense. Why don't men? I mean, for the most part, men live far easier lives in Iran than women. But my younger sister and also my older sister, at times had to cover up without any control or say.
And of course, like Iranian people, before the revolution, they didn't live like this. They were not all covered up.
Right.
Like they had choice.
Right.
I mean, they really. I've seen photographs and videos of the older times. You see them. They dress like Western women.
Very much so. Yeah.
And Western men.
Yep.
So when you met. Of course, you met a lot of Iranians, Persian people, Kurdish people. So, what was your reaction talking to the people? How do they live, really?
We talk about the Iranian government, and I think sometimes we mix the two of people in government, but that's not always the same. Even in the United States, sometimes there's policies here that doesn't reflect the American people, the hospitality, the kind nature that they have. And the same is true for Iran and in the Middle East. Not all people are the same, and because the government is extreme and isn't respecting human rights to the most part, doesn't mean Iranians are all the same. What I sense talking with Kurds and Persians there is that they love the United States. They look up to us in so many ways, culturally, politically, whether it's having a beer on a Saturday night or walking freely wearing shorts and just living life carelessly. That's something that young people especially want, right? It's not being told what to do every second of the day. Government's telling you don't do this, don't do this. It's the notion of freedom. We're young, we live life, and so why should there be anybody to keep on enforcing strict laws? But I think the point is that people love America. They wanted me to speak English to them. They love the language, the culture, and for the most part, the people there were just very hospitable and kind. And unfortunately, this book is seen as a threat to the government. I'd love to go back to Iran. But just talking about the Kurds and showing the Kurdish flag.
I don't think you can go back anymore.
I don't think it's safe for me to do that either, unfortunately.
After this interview too,
Yeah.
So you were detained in Iran for 2 days. Can you talk about that experience?
Yeah.
And why did they arrest you?
Yeah, that was the scariest component. The scariest part I've ever been through. And I honestly didn't think we'd survive. There's been countless stories we talked earlier about a journalist being arrested or even just regular people being detained for no reason. And the book highlights that. I mean, it was one of the biggest events in my life that really showed me a lot. Because I've read books before about Iran and saw movies about the Iranian government, but not all of it made sense. But me traveling back to Iran and seeing the government face to face, it showed me that the government sees its own people as a threat. I mean, I'm a citizen there. And at the time, I was a young kid, and yet we were seen as a threat. And so they detained us, and because we had U.S. passports, accused us of being spies for the government. And so they didn't care if we were underage, if we were young children, if we were women. It didn't matter to them.
What happened? You were on the street and they just took you, or they just come to your house?
Yeah. And so we actually were driving from one city to another city, and we get stopped abruptly. We had no idea people were following us, or there was an intersection.
There was no regular checkpoint.
And so we were coming on this four-way intersection, and we saw that there were a list of soldiers and trucks there. So it was like a blockade, and so we couldn't move forward. And we were told to stop, put your hands up, and show us your identification. And to us, we were young kids from America who don't really see AK-47s or a large assault rifle. You don't see that much here. But they were pointing it at us and screaming loudly. And for anybody, when you're just casually driving and seeing this abruptly happen to you, especially coming from the West, it's absolutely bizarre. And right after that, we were tossed on the street and continue to be asked questions about, why are you here? We know what you're doing. Where's your father? So they kind of knew more about us than we thought. I didn't think anybody would know, really. But they were very fascinated with us being U.S. citizens and visiting back to Iran. They're asking questions of, why are you here? Well, it's my country. Can I not come back? But they were very threatened, and I'm just very lucky to...
Do you speak Farsi?
I speak Farsi, but it's broken. My Kurdish is definitely...
So you spoke Farsi to them?
It was a mix, and so obviously Farsi is the official language in Iran, and that's the language you have to speak with government officials. You can't speak Kurdish, but surprisingly, some of them spoke some Kurdish, and so my mom was kind of the person in charge.
Your mom was with you when you were arrested?
Yeah.
Were you all arrested together?
All together.
Yeah. For 2 days?
For 2 days.
Well, actually, Hawreh, this makes me think of an argument that's made quite often here when, especially every time the Trump administration imposes a new set of sanctions on Iran. Like, a lot of experts argue that these sanctions don't hurt the government as much as they hurt the people of Iran.
Sure.
So when you see, like, this is the experience of average citizens, average people in Iran, they're constantly being watched, arrested, and like, what do you make of this argument? Do you really buy this argument that we should not impose sanctions on Iran just because these sanctions might would end up hurting people? Of course, they would always end up hurting people, but what do you make of that?
Yeah, I think the reality is there's only two solutions with Iran. I mean, you can have temporary peace, but I think the policy regarding the United States has been short-term stability in Iran, right? Many Americans, even the government, don't want another Afghanistan war or an Iraq war. They know it's very costly. A lot of people die, and it causes a lot of disruption in the Middle East, right?
So you think regime change should not be an option?
No, I support regime change 100%, but I think it's a matter of what kind of regime change, right?
I mean, through U.S. military intervention. You don't support that?
And like I said, I think there's different ways of looking at it, because there's going to be a time where we have to say enough is enough. Until when? When people are assassinated in the West by Iranian government, when people are being killed in Iran, executed for no reason, and there's no justice, and millions of people are unsatisfied or dissatisfied with the situation there, right? So what I would like is a revolution within Iran, right? Within.
Without much international intervention.
I mean, I think we need international support, right? But it's a matter of how that support looks like.
But not the Iraq style.
Yeah, I think
because it could lead to more instability.
Definitely.
The same way,
definitely.
What we saw in Iraq.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually a reasonable argument to make. I think a lot of people believe that they probably support the Trump administration's sanctions on Iran, but they are afraid that with hawkish people like John Bolton in the White House and Mike Pompeo in the Department of State, the eventual goal, the ultimate goal of the United States might be regime change through military force. Is that what you believe might happen?
With respect to the sanctions that you talked about, I think one of the points of the sanctions is to put pressure on the people. Right, the government may say, the U.S. government may say our intent is to hurt the government, but enough. There's gonna be a time where we say enough is enough, and the people are gonna. I mean, the economy right now in Iran is tanking. Inflation is high. People are out of work, and so they're suffering. I'm in communication with people overseas, and it's expensive to buy food. I mean, basic necessities are very, very expensive. And so I think part of the strategy here is to say the people within Iran need to wake up. And not just the Kurds, but all other ethnic groups, because it's going to be very difficult for the Kurds to do it all by themselves. It's been done before, and many thousands have been killed. So the point is to create this type of uprising, this movement from within that brings in the Persians, the Azeris, the Kurds, and all the other ethnic groups, and unite them and say, we tried monarchy, that didn't work. We tried this religious state, that didn't work, And so let's try democracy. Democracy is, I think, the best path forward for Iran, and it can unite the country and also the other minorities there.
So, like another question about Kurdish people in Iran. They number some 10 million people. Right?
Yeah, I mean, estimates of 10 to 12 million people.
10 to 12 million people. And, why don't you remind our viewers, why don't you tell our viewers how the Kurds have lived since the Islamic Revolution in Iran? Can you talk about some of the conditions that they have lived in?
Yeah, unfortunately, the history of the Kurds in Iran, obviously the Kurdistan is this region of primarily 4 countries, right? Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria. But with respect to Iran, it hasn't been good. I mean, that's the simple way of saying it. But not only under the Islamic Republic of Iran, but even during the Shah, during the king. So Kurds have been seeing long-term oppression, whether it's under a king or this Ayatollah religious regime. But restrictions are huge. I mean, you can't go on Facebook, you can't go on YouTube, you can't speak freely in Iran. The basic human rights, the basic Bill of Rights, are being hidden from these people and not given that protection as an obligation of a government. But I think for Kurds in particularly, as 2 minorities, right, an ethnic minority but also a religious minority, makes it very difficult to live an ordinary life. What you wear, how you speak, and your personal opinions, none of that matters to the Iranian government. And so it's been about 40 years now where the Iranian government has been in power. But what's interesting is that we're seeing more people, not just the Kurds, but we're seeing Persians, majority ethnic groups, are saying we're sick of it. And so this is a new phenomenon that hasn't been seen before, because when the revolution happened in '79, it was predominantly the bigger cities, a Persian community, were saying we want change. But now today, Persians are saying we're sick of this, And so there's this shift in mental consciousness, saying we need a different path, and this hasn't been working. It's clear, really.
So, Hawreh, recently the United States took this step that had never been taken before, not just toward Iran, but toward any other country.
Right.
The Department of State, under the order of President Trump, designated the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, so-called IRGC, as a foreign terrorist organization, an FTO.
Absolutely.
That designation had previously been only for non-state actors.
Right.
But this is the first time that a government entity, Revolutionary Guard Corps, including Al-Quds force, are basically part of the Iranian military apparatus.
Right.
So, what do you make of that? And do you believe this was a wise decision?
Yeah, I hope it's not semantics. I hope it's not just words coming from the U.S. government, right? Because you can point fingers, and I think recently the Iranian government said, hey, the U.S. Army's a terrorist organization, right? As a response. So I hope it's not just words. But let's look at the facts. Let's look at the history. As I talked about earlier, assassinations, human rights violations. Iran continues to do that to this day, not just in the Middle East, but also in the West. And so I think it's true. I mean, we should call it out. If we see a government, an organization, whether it's in the West or in the Middle East, if they're conducting terrorist activities, let's call it out. And I don't care if it's an organization or a government like Iran, it's true. I think it's 100% true. The activity they've done in the last 40 years, and there's a list of information on the terrorist activities, the organizations they're funding, that's causing disruption, terrorism across the globe, is 100% accurate.
I talked to some Iranians, including Kurds, in the U.S. about this decision. I got 2 different responses, really.
Right.
One, I talked to an Iranian guy, he was Persian, so he basically said he didn't like this decision, and he likened it to the de-Baathification in Iraq. the same way how the de-Baathification led to the unemployment of, let's say, over 1 million people or something like that, millions of people in Iraq, and then a lot of these people ended up joining insurgent groups because they were jobless, and under the Saddam Hussein's regime, they had to be a Baathist in order to get a job, in order to basically have a decent job. So this guy told me this is the same in Iran with the IRGC. If you want to get a decent job in Iran, there are, like he said, 11 million Iranians who are actually members of IRGC, because you cannot have a job without being members of IRGC. So it's like, from his perspective, this designation hurts more than 11 million Iranians. And wouldn't that really create anti-Americanism in Iran?
I'm not sure. I think what's best is let's look at the whole population, right? Population of Iran is about 79, 80 million people. So that's a lot of people. But that's absolutely correct. I think the Iranian government has created this system where you have to be part of the government to vote. You have to support the government 100% or you can't live a life. So we're already seeing that. That's nothing new. But like I said, the situation has gotten so bad economically, politically, socially, religiously too.
And this is also like what you were saying, similar to the argument I heard from somebody else. Like they were saying the life we lived in Iran under the IRGC and how brutal this organization was. Like we were so happy that this happened to IRGC, because IRGC is one of the most brutal forces in Iran.
Absolutely, and I think the Kurdish people, for the most part, here in the U.S. or even within Iran, are happy with his decision, but they're scared. I mean, people are scared to talk to me back home, right? Because I wrote in this book and talking. So imagine living there and just talking about the government. I mean, people see it decaying. People see it falling. I mean, I strongly believe there's going to be a revolution in Iran, and I hope it's a peaceful revolution. I don't want anyone to die. I don't want bloodshed. But let's be clear that the Iranian government will never walk away. It's not, let's say, in Europe where there's a referendum or some sort of reform. We've tried that. It doesn't work. I mean, peaceful transition of power would be brilliant, it'd be beautiful. But I don't see the Iranian government, the mullahs, the extremist wing in Iran, saying, okay, we're sorry for what we did. We're gonna try democracy. We're gonna respect diversity, and be good friends with the United States. I don't see that ever happening. And so what that means is that there needs to be a structural change in Iran. Let people worship however they want, whether you want to be religious or not. If you want to respect communism, socialism, whatever it may be, give the opportunity to people to live life the way they want it to be, but also not making government religiously infused. Like the United States of America, we're a secular state, but yet people can practice however they want.
So back to your book, Finding Kurdistan, a Kurdish-Iranian-American's Journey Home. So, like this includes really detailed conversations that you had with people in Iran, and you say now that as a result of writing this book, you cannot go back to Iran.
I mean, I could probably go back, but I'd probably be arrested or who knows what shortly after.
Do you think it was worth it to write it?
100%. And the reason why is that, and I talk about this, I have hundreds and hundreds of family back home. And I see it as an obligation, as a Kurd, to speak up to them, because they can't speak. They can't wake up in the morning and say...
You thought you had to tell this story.
Absolutely.
And you thought, I mean, to be honest, I mean, I've been a journalist for more than 10 years. So I've read quite a lot about Iranian Kurds. I don't see many writings in English about Iranian Kurds. So I really believe this is a new contribution to the literature we already have on Iran, which is not really much, especially on Iranian Kurdistan.
Right, I see it as an obligation, obviously, because there's not much about it that's been written about the Iranian Kurds, but the situation now more than ever. And so I hope, this is the first step. Hopefully there's going to be more books, and hopefully more people will learn about the Iranian Kurds. And I see it as an obligation to speak up for justice, for inequality, and not allow millions and millions of Kurds and Iranians to live under a brutal government, because I have that protections here. I'm not in fear of this book in the United States, right? And so if they can't speak for themselves, I hope I can do a decent job in giving them a reflective story.
Hawreh, thank you very much.
Thanks so much
for writing this book and for talking to us. I do recommend really all of our viewers to buy a copy of this book, and I'm sure by the end, by the last page, you will know a lot more, and you'll probably have a lot more questions as well about Iran, and enjoy reading this book by Hawreh Haddadi. Until next time and another interview, thank you very much. Bye bye.